They called it a transition meeting. I didn't even have time to close my inbox before I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room with Dean, my supervisor, and a woman from HR I'd never met. The air felt too cold, too clean, like they'd aired it out before I arrived. Dean smiled like we were catching up over coffee. He started with the script, "Elaine, after 17 years of excellent service, we've decided to make some structural changes." The rest of the words came down like snow, soft, quiet, burying me, cost efficiency, restructuring, new direction. The HR woman handed me a manila folder with my name on it. Inside, COBRA insurance details, final paycheck dates, and a list of job assistance resources. "We truly appreciate your loyalty," she said. Her voice was smooth, practiced, like she'd said it a dozen times that week. Dean walked me back to my office with both hands in his pockets. "You'll land on your feet," he said, avoiding my eyes. "You were great. In your time." I didn't argue. I just nodded and began packing. My office wasn't large, but it was mine. The shelves still held the vendor thank you cards I'd collected over the years, some with faded ink and curling edges. I wrapped my ceramic mug in a scarf and placed it beside a framed photo of my team from 2008. The light outside had shifted by the time I boxed my stapler, and the notebooks full of supplier contacts notes I knew no one else had read. Then I heard it. Outside the door, just barely loud enough. "Guess it's true," a voice said, young and smug. "Out with the old." It was Corinne, the scheduler I'd helped train 3 months ago. She had barely started when I'd begun showing her how to track shipments through our outdated system. She'd asked if she could shadow my calls with vendors. I thought she was eager. I didn't realize she was studying my replacement. I taped the box shut, pressed the corners flat, and stood for a moment. The hallway felt longer than usual as I walked it for the last time. I walked through the front doors carrying my box like a prop in a play I hadn't auditioned for. The receptionist, normally quick to greet me with a nod and a joke, glanced down and pretended to type. I passed by Marla from accounting. She busied herself with her phone thumbs tapping like mad. Even Pete from warehouse ops, a man I'd covered countless mistakes for, turned into a statue when I neared. No one said goodbye. No one offered a handshake. Just the quiet shuffle of office life continuing without me. Through the glass wall, I could already see Corinne sitting at what had been my desk. She had a new nameplate. The inbox I'd curated for years now bore her login credentials. She was logging into the CRM like she'd always belonged there. I watched her for a moment as she adjusted the chair I'd brought from home, the one I paid for out of pocket because the company-issued ones hurt my back. She was smiling. I turned away and pushed through the double doors one last time. The sunlight hit too bright after the sterile lighting inside. My car was where I left it, silent and waiting. I placed the box on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel, gripping it, until the feeling in my hands returned. I didn't cry. I drove home along the same route I'd taken every morning for nearly 2 decades. The same 3 lights, the same coffee shop, but everything felt hollow now, like a film set after the crew had packed up. I pulled into the driveway, opened the door, and stepped into a house that suddenly felt foreign. The silence inside was crushing. No phone calls, no meetings, no late emails flagged, urgent at 8:57 p.m. My world had gone from overstretched to empty in under an hour. I set the box down on the kitchen table. It looked ridiculous there, out of place in my real life. I made tea just to have something warm in my hands. As the water boiled, I caught sight of an old email I'd printed 2 months ago, one I'd used to show Corinne how to write proper vendor updates. It still had my red notes in the margins. I remembered how eager she'd looked, how curious. And now she had everything. The first office didn't even have walls, just plywood dividers, and the constant hum of portable heaters in winter. I still remember the drafts that came in through the loading dock doors, and how we used to tape plastic over the windows during the colder months. My desk was a folding table, and my first chair wobbled if I leaned too far to the left. But it was ours. Back then, every shipment out the door felt like a victory. There wasn't a system to inherit. No playbook, no CRM. I made spreadsheets from scratch color-coded by urgency vendor reliability and whether someone had a newborn I needed to ask about before placing an order. I worked late into the night calling time zones from Seoul to San Antonio. Luis from Tucson was the first to take a chance on us. I promised we'd pay on time even if that meant I had to drive the check down myself. Carol from Minneapolis once canceled a contract with a competitor just because she said she trusted my voice more. Dae-jin in Seattle used to joke that I knew his daughter's dance recital schedule better than he did. Those relationships weren't stored on a server. They were in birthdays, remembered problems solved before they escalated, and dozens of shared moments that never made it into memos. Now, from my kitchen table, I watch the company's quarterly updates roll in through my personal email out of habit, not invitation. Corin had sent the new supplier briefings. Each message started the same Dear Valued Partner, followed by clipped summaries and action items. No warmth, no context, no care. Luis didn't respond. Carol had once told me she deleted emails that felt like they were written by a fax machine. And Dae-jin, he'd always said he read tone better than words. He wouldn't miss the change. I folded the printed email in half and placed it face down under my mug. Then I opened my laptop not to work, but to check the news scan old photos and pretend the world hadn't turned the page on me. That's when I saw the missed call from Tucson. The voicemail was short, but his voice carried weight. Elaine, we didn't get the Q2 shipping schedules. Your people okay? Luis had never been the type to panic, but I could hear confusion threading through each word. I hadn't spoken to him since the day I left, and hearing his voice again felt like being pulled into a world I wasn't supposed to belong to anymore. I stared at the phone for a few minutes before responding. A simple text, I'm no longer with them. No explanations, no bitterness, just the truth. He didn't reply. Not right away, and I didn't expect him to. Luis was like that. He processed in silence, and when he made a decision, he didn't go back on it. 2 days later, I received a ping from an old contact in ops. Luis's company pulled out, full stop. No shipments, no reason given. There were no accusations, no dramatic declarations, just sudden stillness where there should have been movement. Inside the company, they spun it quickly. A minor logistics hiccup. Luis has always been a little unpredictable, someone said in a forwarded message. Corin blamed inherited issues in a company-wide update. She talked about outdated processes and lapses in communication, as if none of it had anything to do with how she'd stepped into a role she didn't understand. They didn't see it for what it was, but I did. Luis wasn't unpredictable. He was loyal. For 17 years, he had sent our shipments on time, even when our warehouse flooded or when fuel prices doubled. He didn't pull out because of a schedule. He pulled out because the person he trusted wasn't there anymore. That silence, the kind that arrives without warning, was louder than any resignation letter, and it was only the beginning. A day later, I opened my inbox to see a message from Carol in Minneapolis. She hadn't written to me directly in years. The subject line read, "Did something happen over there?" Carol didn't wait for my reply. She just made her move. Within 3 days, her team sent a formal notice to terminate services. The reason cited operational misalignment. I'd heard her use that phrase once before, years ago, when she dropped a firm that ignored her warnings. It wasn't a complaint, it was a sentence. I didn't reach out. I didn't have to. The message was already being heard in boardrooms across 3 time zones. In the weeks that followed, the silence became a pattern. No lawsuits, no angry calls, just one vendor after another pulling back, disappearing like tiles, quietly slipping from a roof. I kept a list almost involuntarily, 49 names. Some I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Others had sent me Christmas cards every December without fail. But they all left. I could imagine the tension inside the building I used to walk through with coffee in hand and a notebook full of color-coded deadlines. Corinne would be sending follow-ups, copy-pasting apologies, scheduling video calls with blank-screen suppliers, and getting no response. Dean, I heard, had started staying late again. He was never one for overtime unless something was truly wrong. The kind of wrong he couldn't blame on transition. The kind of wrong that couldn't be fixed by rearranging staff meetings or tightening KPIs. I didn't gloat. I didn't post anything. I simply lived my days quieter but heavier. The truth is, I hadn't realized how much of me was tied into those people. My job wasn't just procurement. It was knowing who had a sick child whose parent was in hospice, who needed a little patience during tax season. I didn't manage numbers. I managed trust. That kind of trust doesn't transfer with a login or a folder. I heard through a friend that President Wallace Greer was calling it a vendor crisis. I imagined the phrase bouncing off the walls of the top floor conference room where I'd only been invited twice in 17 years. They were talking about me now, but not by name. And then one morning, as I was pouring coffee into the same chipped mug I'd packed in that cardboard box, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. The hydrangeas were coming in early that year. I was out front, kneeling in the soil, coaxing new buds into place with gloved hands when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, just a string of digits with no name attached. I almost didn't answer. But something in me said to, "Miss Voss." The voice crackled, hesitant, strained. "This is Wallace Greer, president of Horizon Link." I stood up, slowly brushing dirt from my knees, phone pressed against my shoulder. He didn't ask if it was a good time, just plunged in. I've been told what's happening, or rather what's already happened. He wasn't good at small talk. I listened as he stumbled through figures, shipment delays, penalties, stacking into the millions, vendors refusing to return calls, contracts suspended or dissolved mid-cycle. "They won't talk to us," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "Not one of them. They just walked." He cleared his throat, but it didn't steady him. "We had no idea the depth of the relationships you'd built. No one documented any of it. Of course they hadn't. That's the thing about trust. It doesn't live in documents. It lives in habits, consistency names, remembered promises, kept when no one's watching." Then came the line he hadn't rehearsed, the one I knew he'd choke on. "We need you back." The words hung there, more fragile than the petals beside my feet. I let the silence stretch. Not to be cruel, but because it was the first time someone from that company had truly paused to listen. "I'm not interested in coming back the way I left," I said calmly. "Of course," he replied quickly. "We'll make adjustments." "No, you'll go through my terms," I said. "I'll send them by the end of the day." I could hear his breath catch. He wasn't used to someone speaking to him that way, not even his executive team. I hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, typed out my conditions, and sent them from the same personal email they'd once dismissed as unprofessional. Then I pushed my mug aside and opened a blank notepad. I kept the email short, 3 bullet points, no pleasantries. I didn't ask for a title. I didn't ask for an office. I asked for leverage, quiet and absolute. Wallace replied within the hour. Approved. All of it. He didn't argue, and that told me everything. The ground had shifted. They were no longer trying to manage a vendor crisis, they were trying to prevent collapse. There was no welcome memo, no grand announcement. The return was silent, just like the exit. I preferred it that way. Let the message arrive when I did. I knew Dean wouldn't take the news well. He'd built his whole image on being the company's operational anchor, even though I'd been the one fielding late-night calls when freight got stuck in Ontario or contracts defaulted mid-quarter. And Corinne, well, she'd been handed everything. No one had taught her how to hold it. I walked into the building 2 days later with a neutral expression and a leather binder tucked under my arm. No fanfare. Just a pass that still worked somehow, and the feeling of muscle memory in every step I took toward that office. They hadn't even removed my nameplate from the file cabinet. I didn't speak to anyone on my way in, just nodded once at the receptionist, who to her credit looked up this time. I opened the door to the meeting room where I'd asked to begin. It was empty quiet. I laid out my materials, my contact list, and the recovery plan I'd drafted by hand. My first call would be to Daejin. He always appreciated when someone skipped the fluff. My second would be to Carol. She'd want reassurance, not charm. And before the end of the day, I planned to make sure Luis knew I was back. The hallway smelled the same, like old carpet, overused toner, and burnt coffee. I passed familiar doors with unfamiliar names on the glass. But when I reached the department floor, the air changed. Corinne was at her desk clicking through spreadsheets, a headset looped around her neck. She looked up, saw me, and froze. Her cheeks flushed instantly, hands pausing mid-keystroke. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I didn't say a thing, just gave a polite nod and kept walking. Dean came around the corner holding a tablet mid-conversation with someone behind him. He stopped when he saw me blinking, like I'd stepped out of a fog. His voice pitched upward a lane, as though he couldn't quite believe the room hadn't warned him in advance. I kept moving past him without breaking stride. Later that morning, a memo circulated. Effective immediately, Elaine Voss will serve as Interim Director of Strategic Vendor Relations, reporting directly to the board. No explanation, no apology, just placement. I didn't call for meetings or send any welcome notes. I spent the first full day in observation quietly reviewing what had been done, what had been lost, and where the fractures were spreading. I combed through contracts signed in my absence and noted supplier names that hadn't returned a single message since I left. Then just after lunch, the first call came in. "Luis, Elaine," he said. "Is this real enough to fix what's broken?" I said. And just like that, he was back on the board. By the second day, Carol had replied to my email brief, but clear, "If you're back, we'll talk." By the end of the week, Daejin had confirmed a restart of services pending old terms and old trust. Corinne didn't approach me. Dean didn't try to schedule anything. I think they both understood the silence was intentional. The company hadn't brought me back to explain. They brought me back to restore. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't gloating. It was something colder and cleaner, like setting a bone the wrong hands had broken. I spent the next several days doing what no one else had bothered to reading. Every contract signed during my absence went into a separate folder. I didn't skim, I dissected. I highlighted incentive tiers that hadn't existed before. I flagged clauses that left us exposed to penalties for delays we couldn't control. One vendor had been promised exclusive territory rights that directly contradicted 3 existing deals. It wasn't sabotage, it was sloppiness. And sloppiness at this scale costs more than incompetence. It costs credibility. Corinne's name was on most of the drafts. Dean had approved them with boilerplate responses. "Looks fine, move forward." Let's not delay. No one had negotiated. No one had caught the crossovers or asked why rates jumped 12% without explanation. I didn't make noise. I compiled. A single report, 29 pages, clean, annotated. I submitted it directly to the board just as I had negotiated. 2 days later, I was called into a closed session. Wallace sat at the end of the table, shoulders heavier than the first time we'd spoken. There was no tension, just resignation. He didn't try to defend anyone. He thanked me. He asked if I would help guide the recovery process through Q3. Then he said it not loudly, but clearly. "We failed you." I looked at him without blinking. "No," I said. "You failed yourselves." Dean was gone by the end of the week, moved out of the company entirely, though they phrased it as retirement. Corinne was reassigned to support logistics well beneath any position that would touch contracts again. She didn't argue. She barely looked up when I passed her desk. Suppliers had stabilized. Calls were being answered. The bleeding had stopped, but the scar was permanent. I hadn't asked for consequences. I had simply handed them the mirror. After the meeting, Wallace walked beside me through the hallway in silence. When we reached the elevator, he paused. "Why didn't we see it?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just pressed the button and stepped inside. And when the doors opened again on the next floor, I already had a message waiting from a supplier, asking if I was ready to take on more. 3 months later, the corridors no longer echoed with panic. The supplier network with stable shipments were moving without disruption, and penalties had dropped to near zero. The board sent out a glowing internal statement: operational excellence restored. They never mentioned my name, but they didn't have to. Everyone knew who'd done the stitching. The annual board dinner was held at a polished venue downtown, all white linen and silver cutlery. I almost didn't attend, but Wallace insisted. Over seared salmon and a third round of wine, someone at the table, one of the newer board members, raised a glass in my direction. "Good thing we brought you back," he said with a smile, clearly expecting laughter. I didn't smile. I didn't raise my glass. I just looked at him and said, "You didn't bring me back. You realized I never left. You just stopped looking." The table quieted. Wallace cleared his throat, but no one spoke for a moment. Then someone changed the subject and the evening rolled on. Later that week, Wallace asked me to consider staying on permanently. "We'd restructure it around you," he said. "Name your role, your team, your rate." I thanked him. Then I said no. I had already registered the name of my consultancy, Voss Vendor Relations. The logo was simple, the premise even simpler. I would work with firms that understood what they didn't know and respected the people who did. My first client signed before I even launched a website. It was Horizon Link. They retained me not as staff, but as an external partner. I chose the clients I'd support, the terms I'd work under, and the projects I'd prioritize. Wallace called me every 2 weeks, never to dictate, only to ask. I sat at the same kitchen table where I once unpacked my cardboard box, now lit by morning sun and stacked with new contracts waiting for my approval. My mug sat beside me filled with fresh coffee. The nameplate I'd once taken down from my office desk now stood on a shelf behind me, not as a reminder of where I'd been, but of what I'd always been.